Okay, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be starting a new module, Module 5. We're going to be discussing issues of crime and deviance. Again, obviously, when we think about social problems, we often think that crime is a problem in our society, and we're going to take a deep look at that. However, we have to talk about specifically that term, deviance, okay? And discuss the difference between what we might call the popular definition of deviance and the sociological definition. Typically, when we think of the popular definition, someone is described as deviant or engaging in deviance. Someone calls you a deviant. That's going to raise a lot of emotions in us. It's going to make us feel probably very attacked because, of course, the word deviance has a lot of negative connotations attached to it, right? We often think deviance is bad, evil, crazy, just negatively associated, right? So what we have to realize, though, is when we talk about deviance from a sociological definition, that is not the case, right? The deviance doesn't necessarily mean bad or evil or crazy, right? That deviance has a sociological meaning, which quite simply just means violation of a rule. Okay, as we learned many times in Intro to Sociology, if you had it, especially if you had it with me, we definitely know that culture, one of the aspects of culture is a society's values, those things that a society feels, are valuable, right? Valuable, or some values, those thoughts, notions, ideas that a society thinks are important. Norms are those rules that support values, and sanctions are the ways that society reacts, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, to whether or not those rules are being followed or not. And into that comes this idea of deviance. Deviance is simply breaking a rule, okay? So that leads us to a couple other ideas. One is that deviance doesn't necessarily mean bad, because not all rule breaking by definition is necessarily bad or based on evil intent, or we'll take a look at that in just a second. But also that we're all deviant, right? There's not a single person in this class, including myself, right, who has followed all the rules of society or thinks that all the rules of society are necessary, or sometimes don't willingly engage in rule breaking. Sometimes we unintentionally engage in rule breaking, right? And by our definition, we're engaging in deviance. That doesn't mean we're bad or evil people, okay? So there's the difference. Popular construction of deviance, bad, evil, awful, right? Worthy of being punished. Sociological definition is just engaging in some violation of a norm, right? A rule, and those rules can be written down or formal, which we usually call laws in our society, or informal, sometimes known as things like mores or folkways or the unwritten rules, right? So, if we look at it that way, we can look at deviance on a continuum, everything from mild forms of deviance to very extreme forms of deviance, right? And that'll come up in another concept coming up in just a minute or so. So one of the things, especially, we can take a look at is, the working or the works of Emil Durkheim, right? Very prominent early sociologist, one of the founders of sociological thinking, who made several arguments that deviance is actually functional in our society, right? And we've discussed this a little bit before in an earlier module, this idea of many of us who, are sociologists and going to continue on discovering issues of deviance. Those of you who are criminal justice majors and plan to go into, law enforcement, or, those who eventually attend law school to become prosecutors or defense attorneys. You're all going to make a living from the fact that crime exists in a society, right? I've done that for a very long time, and even just engaging in this lecture, the fact that I'm even talking about this and getting paid to do it, right, is an indication that, the fact that crime exists in our society in some ways provides millions of people with jobs and careers, right? So we can definitely look at it that way. Durkheim went farther and basically said that Deviance is functional. Again, it's a part of society and provides, in some ways, valuable benefits to society. He named three specifically. He said that deviance clarifies moral boundaries. Okay? In other words, when people break the rules, then sometimes we then establish or know what the rules are or the penalties for breaking those rules. So again, a common example is, if you're driving down the highway and you're speeding along and going above the speed limit, and then you see off to the side of the road where a police officer has pulled someone else over for speeding, what's your common reaction, right? Whoa, 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 better slow down, right? And you step on the brake or, take your foot off the accelerator and bring your car flat or below the speed limit, right? What we've just demonstrated is, wow, okay, I saw what happens when someone breaks the rules, right? So therefore, I'm not going to break the rules because I don't want that to happen to me. Sometimes we may be unaware that something is a rule or a law in society until either we or someone else around us has violated it, and then it becomes our knowledge. So you might be watching the TV and see that somebody gets arrested for something, and you go, "Wow, I didn't even know that was a rule. Right? I didn't know you could get in trouble for that." And then, according to Durkheim, that would then help you clarify your decisions about how you're going to behave in society. Okay, so Durkheim's first rule, deviance, clarifies the moral boundaries within our society, right? It helps us understand kind of what it is that society is about, what the rules are. His second part is it promotes social unity. All right, we often think about that as kind of counterintuitive. How can deviance help us, maintain more unity in society? We would typically say, okay, if you're breaking the rules, that's separating us. Durkheim argued that when we see rules being broken in society, or we're aware of other people being deviant, it divides us up into kind of us versus them mentality. But that there's more of quote unquote us than there are them. And typically when we think about that, we think about us as being the law abiding citizens, the people who want to do kind of quote unquote what's right in society and follow the rules. And them are the people who break rules, right? Criminals, deviants, that kind of thing. So again, just thinking of a common example, if you and a bunch of friends or family are sitting around maybe watching television, the evening news, or in between shows, the news break comes on and says, X person was arrested in your community for committing acts of child abuse, right? Typically, someone in that group is probably going to say something to terms of like, oh, they ought to take that person, lock them up, and throw away the key, right? And what's the reaction of most other people in that group? Yeah. That's what they should do. They should do that, right? I feel the same way you do about the fact that that person broke a rule. So what Durkheim's saying is that promoting social unity, that when we kind of divide ourselves up into us versus them, law-abiding citizens, rule followers versus rule breakers, it promotes a sense of unity among the people who are following the rules. And then the very last part is that Durkheim talked about was this idea of deviance promotes social change, right? When there are rules in society and a significant number of people, this kind of sounds like our discussion from all the way back from Module 1, but a significant number of people are breaking the rules in society, what's likely to happen? The rules are probably going to change, right? Or become obsolete, or if there's enough people not following them, then there's no reason to enforce them anymore. And society changes, right? Because of that. So, we could even definitely say that, people who were regarded as law breakers at one time in history might be regarded as heroes at another time. Again, slavery and the abolitionist movement is sometimes thought about when we think about this. So enough people were at one time in our society, as we know, slavery was legal. It was legal to own other human beings and treat them as property. And some people said, we don't think that's right. So they freed other people's slaves, literally committing crimes, right? Breaking the law. And again, enough people did it. And obviously other very important historical events happened. But we now largely regard, that behavior as being, not deviant, but honorable, right? So there's lots of different ways that we can look at these things. And again, Durkheim made several points, like I said, about this functionalism of deviance, which brings us to this concept, right? The relativity of deviance. That not all deviance is the same. I kind of mentioned before this idea of continuum, where you could put, minor deviations on one end and more severe deviations on the other. And when we think about that, what we're basically saying, and a rule, kind of this rule, relativity of deviance, is that behavior itself is neither good nor bad. Okay? That's an important statement, and sometimes very controversial. Behavior, actions themselves, are not good nor bad. It's the reaction of society that determines whether or not they're deviant. Okay, so we could definitely say that, and this is, like I said, sometimes a hard thing to stomach when we think about behaviors like child abuse, right? You can never say child abuse is okay. But when we look at this concept in the terms of relativity of deviance, we need to make arguments for, this concept of it's not the action itself, but society's definition or society's reaction to the action that determines deviance. And a prime example I can give you is murder. If I just say, what is murder? Clearly we all say, okay, it's taking human life, and that is wrong, right? However, I could say to you, okay, is all murder wrong? Is all taking of human life necessarily wrong in the eyes of society? And you could make the case for no, not necessarily, because I can say to you, what happens if someone breaks into your house and is trying to harm you or harm members of your family and you kill them, right? Well, we would say, well, that's self-defense, right? Our society makes allowances for if someone's trying to kill you, you may kill them to preserve your own life. And you would say, okay, well, there we go. There's an example of a time when taking a human life is acceptable. I go a step farther and say, what if I join the military during a time of war? And the army hands me a weapon and says, those people over there are our enemy, go kill them. And I go kill them very effectively, right? I kill lots and lots of people. What would society's reaction to that be? Well, in our society, I'd be regarded probably as a hero, right? For doing exactly what I would do if I was home in society doing, I'd be regarded as probably a serial killer or a mass murderer, right? So just that, again, oversimplified example, right, talks about this idea of the relativity of deviance, okay? That is not the action itself, but society's reaction that determines deviance. And when we look at that, we can then ask ourselves questions of how do we compare it? How do we know that relativity is deviant? Again, we can sometimes look at things cross-culturally. We can make cross-cultural comparisons. This idea of, okay, let's, look at what a rule or a behavior is in one society and examine it in another society and see if there's a difference. And we can clearly see that is. We can definitely say that even something as concretely, quote unquote, wrong as incest, sex with other members of your family, can be looked at very differently when we look at them, cross-culturally. So in the United States, we would say it's absolutely wrong to marry anybody who's closer than a second cousin to you. So first cousins and closer brothers and sisters, clearly, parents and children, absolutely not allowed under any circumstances. But is that a universal rule? In other societies around the world, might they have different definitions of what an extended family member is? For some people, what we sometimes call the incest taboo only applies to members of your immediate family, right? And wouldn't necessarily apply to, let's say, like I said, first cousins. Or in some societies, it's acceptable for, a brother and sister. Again, we've seen this throughout history, which we'll talk about again too, in royalty to cement dynasties, right? Or so again, this kind of idea of something we regard as being universal, right? It should never happen. We know if we look at different cultures, there's different examples of that, and I'll come up with some more examples in just a second. And again, the other thing we can examine is whether or not we can look at something temporally, right? right? Or we're going to take a temporal examination of it. And what that usually means is across time, right? So this concept of, okay, there's something that exists in one time in society, deviant in another time. And we could definitely say examples would be even just ongoing in our society, drug use or substance use. Specifically, we could say alcohol, right? At one time in our society, alcohol was not only a common part of American behavior, but also largely unregulated. People were allowed to make their own alcohol. You were allowed to brew beer. You were allowed to distill alcohol, your own. And then we hit a time in society when we engaged in a period of time called Prohibition, when all alcohol production and consumption was illegal, and that lasted for approximately 13 years in our society. And now we've gone to another section where, okay, it's legal, and then for a very long time, between the 1930s and about the 1980s, 90s, okay, it was acceptable to consume alcohol, but you couldn't produce or make alcohol. And now we're seeing some changes in our society where people are now allowed to do things like home brewing and craft brewing, as well as distilling what we call small batch liquor or alcohol, that kind of stuff. So when we look at things temporally, we realize that, yeah, rules change over time in societies. So, again, some other prime examples of the things we've been talking about. Again, we can look at the behavior and then examine it temporally and cross-culturally. Again, things that widely debated back and forth and sometimes very sensitive issues. We can look at something like homosexuality, right? The attraction to people of the same biological gender. Again, very, very, very complex definitions as they've become, right? But prior to the 1960s, homosexuality was thought as quote unquote moral depravity, right? That idea of if you engage in it, you were doing something wrong. Psychologically, people were diagnosed as being homosexual. And again, when we talk about diagnosing something, it's something that needs to be cured, right? Again, cross-culturally, we see lots of differences between different cultures' attitudes about things like gender identity and homosexuality, as well as just sexual identity. So many other cultures, we think about, again, we've been trapped in a very long time and starting to expand as a culture this idea of non-binary sexuality. Many other societies around the world have done that for a very long time. Accepted the idea that it's not just male, female, and gay, straight. So we can definitely see that. Again, drugs, I already mentioned that. Again, prior to the 20th century, things like opium, morphine, laudanum, were commonly consumed. Coca-Cola, as we do today, the product originally contained cocaine, coca leaves in it, right? And was sold across the counter. Definitely we see now today this idea of controlling substances seems quote unquote normal, right? Again, if you look cross-culturally, marijuana, largely to the, becoming different in our society as we challenge more and more of these rules, but still federally regulated. So technically, on the federal level, still a controlled substance. In other societies around the world, used in a religious aspect. Again, Rastafarianism, regards using marijuana in basically religious experiences, looking at use of psychedelic mushrooms or peyote in Native American cultures, and religions. So we definitely know that these things have cross-cultural and temporal elements to them, which demonstrates this relativity of deviance. Okay, so how does this break down? Typically, from a critical constructionist point of view, what we basically say is, different groups in society compete with each other for resources, and often it's along the terms of what we define as deviance, right? One group says this is wrong, and another person says it's not, and that causes conflict in society. We see that now when we talk about this concept of quote unquote legalization of marijuana. So, this sometimes pits when we talk about, again, when I talked about homosexuality earlier, when it was a diagnosable disorder. Well, many then homosexual groups lobbied and pulled together resources to try to get those rules changed, and they were successful in that. So again, talk about this idea of groups conflicting with one another. When we talk about critical constructionism, what we're adding is the element of who decides what is quote unquote deviant or illegal in a society, who doesn't. And of course, from a critical constructionist point of view, we're looking at how do the elite maintain that control in society over determining what's legal and illegal. So again, we got to ask ourselves, like we've done from the very beginning, why this and not that? So if we think about substances, why are tobacco and alcohol legal in our society and crack cocaine and heroin illegal, right? And largely, from a critical constructionist point of view, it's, well, who's producing these things, right? Are there, large corporations making things like tobacco and alcohol products, which have a very vested interest in keeping those things legal, right? Whereas other types of substances, crack cocaine, heroin, are not being mass produced by people in factories, making lots of money off it. So therefore, we're going to have rules against, them being legal. So we definitely know there's millions of addicts of tobacco and alcohol in our society. Alcohol frequently involved in acts of violence in our society, and drunk driving. Tobacco, we definitely know, is a very dangerous substance in terms of individuals' health and health of other people associated with that. But largely, we can say that these things remain legal in our society. In other words, not necessarily defined as deviant, because there are significant people in society deciding that they should not be regarded as such. Okay? Thank you.